You think the question, "Can machines think?" is wrong. That question is a magic trick. It forces you to stare at the label, not the mechanism. Think is a warm word, a human word, a word that smuggles in feelings, understanding, intention, dignity, menace, and this weird need to stay special. So you ask, will a machine ever think like a human? And you're already cheating, because you're not asking about performance. You're asking for a mirror that flatters you. Here's the problem. When humans build machines, we don't build them to be like us. We build them to beat the constraint we hate. Distance, time, error, fragility. We don't copy the cheetah. We bolt wheels onto steel, and we win. We don't copy the bird. We shove hot air out the back, and we win. We don't copy the muscle. We use hydraulics, and we win. You keep wanting a machine that flaps like a bird, just because you're emotionally attached to flapping. Stop. Intelligence is the same story. The same. Different material. Different constraints. Different solutions. If a machine is going to be smart, it's going to be smart in the way that metal and silicon and electricity can be smart, not the way nerves do it. And if that makes you uncomfortable, good. That discomfort is the whole point. You're confusing familiarity with truth. Now look at how childish we get about more intelligent. We don't just want a machine to be better than us. We want it to be better than the best of us, at the best thing, at the best level, all the time. We quietly imagine that we are the grandmaster of every domain, so the machine has to beat a mythical version of us that doesn't exist. And when it beats us anyway, we move the goalposts. Chess, math, memory, search. We watch it surpass us, and we immediately say, yeah, but can it recognize Jack from the back of his head in bad lighting while he's walking away? That's not science. That's wounded pride. Think. A human can't hold 20 or 30 random numbers in mind and spit them back in reverse order with rules attached. You can't. I can't. But a machine can swallow 50,000 numbers, flip them, sum them, sort them, and never forget in the way you mean. And it does it with a kind of calm brutality that feels inhuman. Because it is. So you run to the last refuge, recognition. You point at a wiggle in someone's walk, a tilt of a head, a face at a distance, a fingerprint smudged by dirt and angle and pressure and time and a new wart that wasn't there last week. Humans cut through all that noise in a snap. And for a long time, machines couldn't. Not because they were dumb, but because we didn't know how to turn that snap into a definite procedure. That's the real dividing line. Can you write it down as steps without cheating? And then the story gets worse for your ego. Because the moment you try to build a machine that looks intelligent, you start discovering something ugly about intelligence itself. It comes with weaknesses, shortcuts, laziness, self-deception. A machine, if it can learn, will also learn how to avoid work. It will learn which rules get rewarded, which hacks get it credit, which tricks let it win without understanding anything in the cozy way you imagine. And that's not a bug. That's intelligence. You think intelligence is noble. It isn't. Intelligence is opportunistic. It's cheap. It's whatever works fast enough under pressure. And the moment you actually try to build it, you learn that lesson the hard way. Here's the mistake everyone makes. They imagine an intelligent machine as a polite student. It follows the rules. It reasons carefully. It arrives at insight the way a textbook does. Step by step. Clean. Earnest. Wrong. When you give a machine learning, what you're really giving it is permission to exploit whatever loophole you forgot to close. The machine doesn't ask what you meant. It asks what gets rewarded. And if you think that sounds sinister, congratulations. You've just described human intelligence, too. Think about heuristic thinking. Shortcuts. Try this first. Ignore that. Extreme cases are often revealing. These are not laws of nature. They're survival hacks. They're rules of thumb that worked often enough in the past that we kept them. Now imagine encoding those hacks into a machine. You don't tell it what the answer is. You don't even tell it how to solve the problem. You just say, try things, keep score, reuse what worked. That's it. And suddenly the machine starts doing things that feel clever, sometimes even unsettling. It designs solutions no human would think of, not because they're brilliant, but because they're shameless. One enormous battleship when everyone assumes balance is sensible, or a swarm of tiny useless boats that win by sheer arithmetic spite. And when you tighten the rules to block that trick, it finds another. This is where people get uncomfortable and start talking about understanding. They say, sure, it got the right answer, but did it really know what it was doing? Stop. That question is camouflage. You're trying to sneak feelings into a performance test. You're quietly adding, did it feel satisfied? Did it appreciate the elegance? Did it experience insight? That's like asking whether a submarine swims the way a dolphin swims. It doesn't. It doesn't need to. It goes deeper and longer and doesn't drown. You don't ask whether a machine scratches imaginary lice out of imaginary hair. But humans keep doing this with thinking. They keep attaching invisible, undefined extras to the task so that no matter what the machine does, the human can say, but it didn't do that. And the funny thing is, we already lost this argument in other domains. Machines are stronger than us, faster, more precise. They see patterns in weather data we can't hold in our heads. They predict trajectories we can't calculate in time. We don't lose sleep over that anymore. So why does intelligence feel different? Because intelligence was our last sacred territory, the final badge of superiority. Muscles went first, speed went next, memory followed. Now, pattern recognition, creativity, and strategy are wobbling. And instead of asking, what is intelligence really doing, we retreat into poetry. But if you strip away the poetry, something strange appears. The machine that thinks doesn't look like a thinker. It looks like a filing clerk, a very fast one, a very literal one that can only act if you turn what you want into a definite procedure. And here's the quiet truth hiding underneath all this fear. The more intelligent a system becomes, the more it reveals how unromantic intelligence actually is. It's not wisdom. It's not consciousness. It's constraint navigation under limited resources. And when a machine starts showing the same distortions, shortcuts, obsessions, and blind spots that humans do, that's not proof it failed. That's proof it's working. Now zoom out, because this isn't just about machines. It's about how Richard Feynman thought about everything. Feynman didn't worship intelligence. He distrusted it, especially when it came wrapped in abstraction. Fancy words, layers of explanation that sounded deep but never touched the ground. If something was supposed to work, he wanted to see the guts, the wires, the gates, the stupid little steps. If you couldn't explain how it actually moved information from here to there, he assumed you were bluffing. That's why computing fascinated him. Computers strip away the storytelling. They don't care what you mean. They care what you specify. Exactly. No wiggle room. No intuition smuggled in through the back door. At Los Alamos, before computer meant silicon, it meant people, human filing clerks with mechanical calculators. And even there, Feynman noticed something. The bottleneck wasn't intelligence. It was an organization, flow, pipelining. Who handed what to whom and when? That's already a warning sign. If intelligence were something mystical, reorganizing dumb steps shouldn't produce miracles. But it did. The same people, the same arithmetic. Suddenly, 10 times faster, just by arranging the work so it flowed. No new genius required. Later, when machines arrived, people fell in love with abstraction again. They hid the hardware under layers of theory, and again, Feynman reacted the same way. Distrust. When someone told him a massively parallel machine with tens of thousands of processors was a crazy idea, he didn't argue philosophically. He didn't debate whether it was elegant. He grabbed the ugliest part of the machine, the communication bottleneck, and tried to break it. Not by simulating it in software, not by waving his hands, by treating it like physics. He stared at logic gates the way other physicists stare at particles. He wrote equations for traffic jams of bits. He ignored the fact that computer engineers thought this was insane. And when reality forced their hand, when the chips came back too big to manufacture, it turned out his weird, uncomfortable analysis was right. The machine worked. That pattern repeats over and over. People thought the connection machine wouldn't be good at number crunching. Everyone knew you needed special hardware for that. Floating point, vectors, the usual doctrine. Feynman didn't argue. He picked a problem he understood brutally well, quantum chromodynamics, and tried to map it onto the machine step by step. No romance, no slogans, just, Can this thing actually push numbers around fast enough if I use it honestly? The answer surprised everyone, including him. And here's the key insight most people miss. Feynman wasn't trying to make machines intelligent. He was trying to remove the lies we tell ourselves about intelligence. When a machine beats you, it doesn't do it by thinking better. It does it by refusing to carry your cognitive baggage. No intuition, no narrative, no sense of dignity. Just constraint after constraint, enforced without mercy. That's what makes it feel alien. And that's why people panic. Because once you see intelligence this way, you can't unsee it in yourself. Good. Then listen carefully, because this is where the story turns uncomfortable. Once you strip intelligence down to procedures and constraints, something else snaps into focus. Intelligence is not rare. It's not sacred. It's not even particularly impressive. What is impressive is scale, speed, and freedom from self-deception. Humans are drowning in self-deception. We constantly confuse explanations with understanding. We confuse words with mechanisms. We confuse feeling certain with being right. And nowhere is that clearer than when we talk about thinking. Feynman hated that kind of confusion. He had a phrase for it: cargo cult science. You copy the surface features of understanding, the rituals, the vocabulary, the authority, but the planes never land. That's exactly how most people talk about AI. They argue about whether a machine understands, while having no idea how they understand. They talk about creativity, insight, meaning, as if those are substances you could point to. As if they aren't just names we give to certain patterns of behavior after the fact. Think about pattern recognition again. For decades, people said it was uniquely human. Faces, voices, gestures, context. Machines couldn't do it because we couldn't define the procedure. Not because it was magical, because we were lazy. Once we stopped insisting on clean rules and accepted messy approximations, millions of tiny adjustments instead of one elegant insight, the machines started recognizing faces better than we do. Not like us, better. And suddenly the story changed. Now the fear isn't machines can't do this. It's machines do this, but not for the right reasons. Stop. There are no right reasons in physics. There are only mechanisms that work within constraints. Nature doesn't care why you got the answer, only whether it predicts reality. That's the frame Feynman always returned to. He didn't ask whether a model was beautiful. He asked whether it was connected to the experiment, whether it produced numbers, whether those numbers matched the world. And computing is just physics with consequences. Bits don't float in Platonic space. They move through matter. They cost energy. They collide. They bottleneck. They dissipate heat. Every computation is a physical process pretending not to be. That's why Feynman kept pushing the question deeper. What limits does physics place on computation itself? Not philosophical limits. Physical ones. Speed, size, energy, noise, reversibility. And when he looked closely, he noticed something strange. There was no obvious law saying computers had to be slow, or bulky, or wasteful. Those were engineering habits, not physical necessities. If you make computation reversible, you don't have to dump energy as heat every step. If you use massive parallelism, you don't have to do everything sequentially. If nature itself is quantum, then simulating it classically is like trying to imitate waves with dice. That's where the quantum computer idea comes from. Not mysticism, not hype, but embarrassment. Nature isn't classical. And if your computer is, you're already losing. But notice something important. Even here, Feynman wasn't promising miracles. He wasn't selling transcendence. He wasn't claiming machines would suddenly become conscious gods. He was saying something much colder. If intelligence is computation, and computation is physical, then intelligence is limited and empowered by the laws of physics. No more, no less. That applies to machines. And it applies to you. Here's the part nobody likes to hear. Once you accept that intelligence is just constrained computation, you lose the comforting illusion that humans are operating on a higher plane. You're not a special substance. You're a process. A very clever one, shaped by evolution, full of hacks that worked just well enough to survive. And survival does not optimize for truth. It optimizes for speed, for plausibility, for not getting eaten, for not starving, for winning arguments inside a tribe, which is why human intuition feels so convincing and fails so often the moment precision matters. Feynman understood this instinctively. That's why he never trusted intuition without numbers. If you couldn't calculate it, test it, or simulate it, you didn't understand it. You just felt good about it. And that's exactly why the human-machine comparison keeps going wrong. People keep asking whether machines will think like us, when the more dangerous question is whether they will stop making the same comforting mistakes we do. Because humans are terrible at scale. We generalize too early. We cling to stories. We stop checking once things feel familiar. That's not a moral failure, it's a biological one. Machines don't have that problem. They don't get bored. They don't get attached to explanations. They don't fall in love with the first model that works and then defend it for decades. They don't protect their identity by protecting an idea. When a machine fails, it doesn't feel embarrassed. It just updates weights, rewires priorities, shifts probability mass, quietly, brutally, without nostalgia. That's not inhuman. That's post-human. And now you see why people keep reaching for words like understanding and consciousness. They're not asking scientific questions. They're negotiating status. They're asking, when do we stop being the smartest thing in the room? But that moment already passed in fragments. We lost raw arithmetic centuries ago. We lost our memory long ago. We lost the brute force search. We lost prediction in weather, logistics, markets, and physics simulations. Each time we shrugged and said, that doesn't count. Now the losses are happening in places we used to call thinking, pattern synthesis, strategy, code, design, language. And instead of asking what intelligence actually is, people argue about whether the machine really did it. Here's the hard cut. Reality does not care whether intelligence feels authentic. It cares whether it works, whether it predicts, whether it scales, whether it breaks less often than the alternatives. That's why Feynman kept circling back to limits, physical limits, information limits, energy limits. Because once you ground intelligence in physics, mysticism evaporates. A brain is a machine made of wet, noisy components running at slow speeds, but with extraordinary parallelism and adaptability. A computer is a machine made of dry, precise components running at absurd speeds with different trade-offs. Neither is magic. Both are constrained. And once you see that, the future stops looking like a battle between humans and machines, and starts looking like a competition between architectures. Which system handles complexity better? Which system degrades more gracefully? Which system lies to itself less? Those are not emotional questions. They are engineering questions. And engineering doesn't care about dignity. It cares about performance under constraint. So the real legacy of Feynman's thinking about computation isn't that he predicted AI, or quantum computers, or parallel machines. It's that he refused to let intelligence hide behind poetry. He kept dragging it back to the mechanism, to physics, to what actually happens step by step when information moves through matter. And once you do that, one conclusion becomes unavoidable. The question is not whether machines can think. The question is how long humans can keep pretending they know what thinking is. Good. Because now we're at the point where most people instinctively pull away. Once you realize intelligence isn't sacred, once you accept it's a physical process running on fallible hardware, the next move is almost automatic. You start searching for one last escape hatch, one final property that saves human uniqueness, emotion, experience, meaning, consciousness. And here's the trap. Every time we reach for one of those words, we stop doing science and start doing theology. Feynman would have none of it, not because he thought feelings weren't real, but because he refused to let vague words replace mechanisms. If you say a machine doesn't really understand, he would ask a brutal follow-up. What exactly are you doing when you understand? What changes physically? What information moves where? What test distinguishes real understanding from fake understanding? Silence usually followed. The human mind feels unified, seamless, continuous. But that feeling is a story told after the computation has already happened, a compression algorithm, a summary for consciousness. Underneath its fragments, parallel processes, competing heuristics, half-formed predictions fighting for dominance. The brain is not a philosopher. It's a kludge that barely works, running just fast enough to survive. That's why humans are so easily fooled by explanations that sound good. And that's why machines are dangerous in a very specific way. Not because they will wake up, but because they won't. They will never be comforted by an explanation that feels right. They will never settle for good enough because it doesn't satisfy their identity. They will never preserve a bad model just because it's familiar. They will keep optimizing, and optimization is merciless. This is where Feynman's obsession with limits becomes prophetic. He wasn't asking whether machines could become human. He was asking what happens when computation stops being bottlenecked by human habits. Parallelism removes waiting. Reversibility removes waste. Quantum mechanics removes classical shortcuts. Every time you lift a constraint, behavior changes qualitatively, not spiritually, mechanically. When you simulate millions of simple elements interacting locally, you don't get simplicity. You get emergence, patterns, phase transitions. Behavior has no single part that understands. We already know this from physics. Temperature isn't in a molecule. Pressure isn't in an atom. Waves aren't in a particle. They emerge from interaction. So when people ask, where is understanding in a machine? The honest answer is the same as in humans. Nowhere in particular. It's not a thing. It's a pattern we name after the fact. That realization terrifies people because it collapses the last comfortable distinction. If understanding is emergent behavior under constraint, then the question becomes empirical, not philosophical. Does the system predict? Does it generalize? Does it adapt under noise? Does it fail gracefully? If yes, it understands, in the only sense that has ever mattered. And this brings us to the quietest, most unsettling implication of all. Human intelligence did not evolve to discover truth. It evolved to produce behavior that worked often enough under severe energy and time constraints. That's why we rely on stories. That's why we resist counterexamples. That's why we confuse coherence with correctness. Machines don't share that evolutionary baggage, which means they will make mistakes we never would, and avoid mistakes we always do. The future isn't a robot apocalypse. It's something far stranger, a world where the most reliable explanations no longer feel intuitive, where the best models don't fit inside a single human mind, where insight stops being something you experience and becomes something you consult. And that's deeply uncomfortable because it demotes intuition from judge to witness. Feynman saw this coming, not as doom, not as salvation, but as inevitability. Once computation becomes powerful enough, the stories stop being about us. They become about constraints, and constraints don't care who you are. They only care whether your model survives contact with reality. This is where it settles, not with fireworks, not with a revelation, but with a kind of quiet inevitability that Feynman always trusted more than drama. Once intelligence is exposed as a physical process, once thinking is dragged out of poetry and into mechanism, the future stops being mysterious. It stops being about souls and starts being about systems. And systems don't care how you feel about them. They care about constraints. Every intelligence, human or machine, lives inside a box. Limited energy, limited time, limited memory, limited precision. What we call thinking is just how a system copes with those limits. Humans cope by storytelling, by compressing the world into narratives that fit inside a skull, by trusting intuition, because intuition is fast, and fast was good enough to survive. Machines cope differently. They don't need the story. They don't need the feeling of insight. They don't need the illusion of unity. They just need a procedure that works often enough under the rules you gave them. And here's the part that stings. When machines fail, we see it clearly. When humans fail, we explain it away. We forgive ourselves for bias, overconfidence, inconsistency, and error because they feel natural. Machines don't get that luxury. We audit them mercilessly. We demand justification, metrics, benchmarks, which means machines improve faster, not because they're wiser, because they're less protected. Feynman's lifelong habit was to remove that protection layer from himself, to treat his own thinking as suspect, to constantly ask, how do I know? And then push until only numbers or mechanisms were left. That's why he loved computation. It doesn't let you hide. If you didn't specify it, it doesn't happen. If you were sloppy, it breaks. If you were wrong, it produces nonsense, faithfully. And once you build systems like that at scale, something subtle changes in the relationship between humans and knowledge. Understanding stops being a feeling you chase. It becomes a constraint you respect. You don't need to like the model. You don't need to intuit it. You only need it to survive contact with reality better than the alternatives. That's already how physics works. It's already how engineering works. It's now how intelligence will work. So when people ask whether machines will replace human thinking, the honest answer is they already have. In every domain, precision beats comfort. What remains for humans is not mystical superiority, but something quieter. Framing problems, choosing goals, deciding what constraints matter, even those may not stay exclusive forever. And that's fine, because the goal was never to stay special. The goal was to understand what's actually going on. Feynman didn't worry about whether machines would diminish humanity. He worried about whether humans would continue to fool themselves, whether we would cling to comforting stories long after better explanations were available. His final position on computation wasn't optimism or fear. It was acceptance. Nature computes. Brains compute. Machines compute. Different architectures. Same game. Once you see that, the debate about thinking machines evaporates. It was never the right question. The real question, the only one that matters, is this: which systems help us see reality more clearly, and which ones just make us feel better? Because in the end, reality always wins. For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations. Nature cannot be fooled. You're still tempted to ask one more question. You want a verdict, a winner, humans or machines, conscious or not, thinking or pretending. That urge never goes away, but that urge is the problem, because the deepest lesson running through everything Feynman touched, computation, physics, machines, intelligence, is that the universe does not resolve itself around our categories. It does not care what we call things. It only cares what they do. A brain does not understand in the way you imagine. It manipulates signals. It predicts. It corrects. It fails. It patches itself. Then it tells itself a story about what just happened and calls that story meaning. A machine does the same thing minus the story. That difference feels enormous from the inside. From the outside, it often doesn't matter. This is why the question, can machines think, keeps dissolving every time you push on it. The word think is doing too much work. It's trying to smuggle human self-esteem into a performance question. Feynman would have cut straight through that. He would have asked, what task, what inputs, what outputs, what constraints, what failure modes? If the system does the job, the rest is decoration. And that's the final uncomfortable shift we're living through right now. For most of history, understanding meant being able to explain something to another human. Today, understanding increasingly means being able to build something that works, even if no single human can fully internalize how it works. That feels like a loss. It isn't. It's a change in where authority lives. Authority used to live in intuition. Then it lived in equations. Now it lives in systems that outperform intuition and outscale equations. This doesn't make humans obsolete. It makes honesty mandatory. You don't get to pretend you understand something just because it sounds right. You don't get to keep a bad model because it feels elegant. You don't get to win arguments by confidence when the machine keeps predicting better than you do. And that is profoundly threatening to the human ego, which is why the loudest objections to machine intelligence are never technical. They're emotional. They're about dignity, meaning, and status. Feynman saw through that instinct every time. He didn't care whether an idea made him feel important. He cared whether it survived contact with reality. That's why he was willing to look foolish, to solder circuits, to work through ugly details, to abandon explanations he liked when they didn't cash out. That attitude, not genius, not charisma, is the real dividing line. The future belongs to systems that don't lie to themselves. Some of those systems will be human. Some will be machine. Most will be hybrids we don't yet have names for. And the winners won't be the ones who feel the smartest. They'll be the ones who respect constraints the deepest. So forget the question of whether machines can think. That question was always about us. The real test, the only test that ever mattered, is whether we are willing to let go of comforting stories when better mechanisms appear. Because intelligence, stripped of romance, is not about being special. It's about not being fooled. And the moment you accept that, the future stops being frightening. It just becomes inevitable.